The millionaire's sneer cut through the marble lobby of Chicago's Millennium Tower like a blade through silk, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt that money breeds in empty souls. "If you were rich, what would you do with this?" Travis Kane laughed, flicking a sleek black card onto the worn wooden desk where Robert Harris had sat for 17 years, watching, listening, remembering everything. The card landed with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the pristine space, a sound that would haunt the walls long after the laughter died. Robert's weathered hands, marked by decades of honest labor, caught the card without a word. His eyes, those deep brown eyes that had seen more than any surveillance camera, betrayed nothing. Silence swallowed the room whole, thick with the sting of humiliation and the cold indifference that wealth so often mistakes for power. "I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway right now, your footsteps echoing in empty corridors. Or perhaps you're checking security cameras in some forgotten corner of a building, watching over people who never see you. It doesn't matter what time it is, whether the sun is setting over Lake Michigan or the morning rush is just beginning on Michigan Avenue. But I promise you, today's story will shake something deep inside your chest, something that's been sleeping too long under layers of quiet endurance and unspoken dignity. Meet Robert Harris, a man whose story lives in the shadows of Chicago's gleaming towers, in the spaces between the marble columns and behind the polished brass elevators of one of the city's most prestigious addresses. At 57, Robert carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that comes not from wealth or status, but from knowing your own worth even when the world refuses to see it. His uniform, pressed each morning with the same care he gave to everything else, bore the subtle traces of countless small services, a thread pulled here, a small stain there, evidence of a life spent in service to others who rarely acknowledged his existence. The Millennium Tower rose 43 stories into the Chicago sky, its glass facade reflecting the ambitions and secrets of those wealthy enough to call it home. Penthouses sold for millions, their floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city sprawling toward the horizon. But Robert's world existed primarily in the lobby, the mailroom, the service corridors that ran like arteries through the building's heart. He knew every tenant by name, remembered their preferences, their schedules, their small kindnesses and casual cruelties. Mrs. Davidson in 12A always said good morning and asked about his grandchildren. Mr. Chen from the 20th floor nodded politely and sometimes shared stories about his native Taiwan. But Travis Kane, the man who owned the entire 43rd floor, had never once looked Robert in the eye during their 5 years of daily encounters. Kane's fortune came from cryptocurrency investments, early Bitcoin purchases that had multiplied into an empire worth hundreds of millions. His penthouse, valued at $12 million, served as both home and symbol of his success. The man collected expensive art, drove cars worth more than most people's houses, and wore suits that cost more than Robert's monthly salary. Yet for all his wealth, Kane possessed something that no amount of money could buy away, a deep, gnawing insecurity that manifested as cruelty toward those he perceived as beneath him. The November morning when everything changed started like any other. Robert arrived at 5:30, an hour before his shift officially began, using his personal key to enter through the service entrance. He liked these quiet moments before the building awakened, when he could move through the spaces he maintained with a sense of ownership that came not from legal documents, but from care. He straightened magazines in the lobby, checked that the flowers were fresh, ensured that every surface gleamed under the carefully positioned lighting. This was his domain, his responsibility, and he took pride in maintaining it perfectly. The building's residents began their day around 7, emerging from elevators in expensive suits and designer dresses, their footsteps clicking across the marble floors that Robert had polished to mirror brightness. Most passed without acknowledgement, their eyes focused on phones or fixed on destinations beyond these walls. Robert understood this invisible existence, had long ago made peace with being essential yet unseen. He was the keeper of keys, the guardian of mail, the man who made sure everything worked seamlessly so that others could focus on their important lives. But invisibility, Robert had learned, could be a kind of superpower. Standing behind his desk, sorting mail and packages, he observed everything. He knew about Mrs. Patterson's affair with her yoga instructor, evidenced by the flowers that arrived every Tuesday when her husband traveled. He understood that Mr. Wu from the 32nd floor was having financial troubles, based on the collection notices that arrived with increasing frequency. He'd witnessed Kane's son David visiting late at night, their conversations muffled but clearly heated, the young man's shoulders slumped with some burden his father refused to acknowledge. Robert's memory worked like a vast filing system, cataloging details that others missed or dismissed. He remembered conversations overheard in elevators, fragments of phone calls made while waiting for rides, the subtle changes in behavior that revealed more than any security report. This information wasn't gossip to him. It was understanding, the kind of human knowledge that came from paying attention to people as complete beings rather than simply as sources of income or inconvenience. His own life existed in the margins of these observations. Robert lived in a small apartment in Pilsen, a neighborhood where the rent was manageable on his concierge salary and where the scent of fresh tortillas from the corner bakery greeted him each evening. He'd raised 3 children there, watched them grow and succeed and move to better neighborhoods, sending money home when they could and visiting on Sundays for dinner and stories. His wife Maria had passed 2 years ago, leaving behind a hole in his daily routine that he filled with extra hours at work and longer walks along the lakefront. The morning routine continued with mechanical precision until Travis Kane stepped off the private elevator that served only the penthouse, his presence announced by the soft chime that always made Robert straighten unconsciously. Kane moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to occupy any space he chose, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble with the rhythm of entitlement. He wore his wealth-like armor, the expensive watch, the perfectly tailored suit, the subtle cologne that cost more per ounce than Robert earned in a day. Kane approached the concierge desk with the predatory smile of someone about to deliver what he considered entertainment. In his manicured hand, he held a black card, not a credit card, but something else entirely, matte black with subtle silver lettering that caught the light. "Robert," he said, drawing out the name as if tasting something unpleasant. "I've been thinking about you." The words carried the tone of someone about to share a particularly amusing joke, though Robert suspected he wouldn't find it funny. "Yes, Mr. Kane," Robert replied, his voice steady despite the familiar tightness in his chest that Kane's attention always brought. Years of service had taught him to read the moods of the wealthy, to anticipate their needs and navigate their whims. But something in Kane's expression this morning felt different, more deliberately cruel than his usual casual dismissal. Kane placed the black card on Robert's desk with theatrical precision, his fingers drumming against the wood as he leaned forward. "This is a membership card to the most exclusive investment club in Chicago," he said, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Annual dues of $50,000 just to join, minimum investments of $1 million. Members have access to cryptocurrency portfolios, private equity deals, real estate syndicates that most people can only dream about." He paused, savoring the moment like fine wine. "Now, Robert, I want you to imagine, just for a moment, what you would do with something like this." The question hung in the air like smoke, its implications clear to both men. Kane wasn't asking out of curiosity or genuine interest in Robert's aspirations. This was performance art, a demonstration of power disguised as conversation. Robert's weathered hands remained steady as he looked down at the card, its surface reflecting the lobby's crystal chandeliers. The black material felt substantial, expensive, carrying the weight of exclusion as much as privilege. "I suppose," Robert said carefully, his voice carrying no hint of the humiliation Kane clearly intended to inflict, "I would try to use it wisely." The simple response seemed to frustrate Kane, who had clearly expected pleading or admiration or some other display of the vast gulf between their circumstances. Kane's laugh was sharp, designed to cut. Wisely, he repeated the word as if it were foreign. Robert, you make what, 40,000 a year? Maybe 50 with overtime? This card represents more wealth than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. Members discuss Bitcoin portfolios worth hundreds of millions, property investments that could buy entire city blocks. They make decisions over lunch that move markets. He leaned closer, his cologne mixing with the scent of fresh flowers Robert had arranged that morning. What could someone like you possibly understand about wisdom when it comes to real money? The cruelty was casual, delivered with the same tone Kane might use to comment on the weather. Robert felt the familiar burn of injustice, the particular pain that comes from being treated as less than human by someone whose existence you've helped make possible through thousands of small, unacknowledged services. But he'd learned long ago that dignity meant not giving people like Kane the reaction they sought. Instead, he nodded slowly and slipped the card into his shirt pocket, a gesture that seemed to surprise the millionaire. "I'll hold on to it," Robert said quietly, "in case I ever become the kind of person who deserves it." The words carried no sarcasm, no hint of anger, just the steady certainty of someone who understood his own worth regardless of external validation. Kane's expression flickered with something that might have been confusion. He'd expected gratitude or resentment, not this calm acceptance that somehow felt like defiance. "You do that, Robert," Kane said, straightening his tie with unnecessary force. "You hold on to it and dream about what it would be like to be someone who matters." He turned away without waiting for a response, his expensive shoes clicking across the marble as he disappeared into the Chicago morning, leaving behind only the lingering scent of cologne and the echo of casual cruelty. Robert remained at his desk, the weight of the black card pressing against his chest like a small, dark promise. Around him, the building hummed with its usual morning energy, elevators rising and falling, residents hurrying toward their important days, the subtle machinery of wealth and privilege operating with clockwork precision. But something had shifted in that brief, cruel exchange, some balance that Robert couldn't yet name, but could feel as surely as the card against his heart. The day continued with its familiar rhythms, but Robert found himself thinking about Kane's words, not with shame, but with the kind of analytical curiosity that had served him well over the years. There was something desperate in the millionaire's need to humiliate him, something that spoke to deeper insecurities than Robert had previously understood. Wealth, he'd observed, could be its own kind of prison, trapping people behind walls of money and forcing them to maintain impossible standards of superiority. Perhaps Kane's cruelty came not from strength, but from a fear that without these constant demonstrations of power, he might discover he was no different from anyone else. As the morning stretched toward afternoon, Robert continued his duties with the same quiet competence that had defined his 17 years in the building. He signed for packages, directed visitors, answered questions with patient professionalism. But the black card remained in his pocket, a small reminder of the morning's encounter and the particular kind of blindness that money could create. He didn't yet know that this card, given as an instrument of mockery, would become something else entirely, a key to understanding not just Kane's world, but the hidden vulnerabilities that all his wealth couldn't protect. The autumn light streaming through the lobby's tall windows began to fade as Robert's shift neared its end, painting the marble floors in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of Maria's hair in their early years together. Tonight, he would walk home to Pilsen, stopping at the corner market for ingredients to cook dinner for one, spending his evening reading or watching the news, living the quiet life of someone whose greatest wealth lay not in bank accounts, but in the satisfaction of work done well and days lived with dignity. The black card would come with him, not as a symbol of what he lacked, but as evidence of something he possessed in abundance, the kind of character that no amount of money could buy or destroy. The next 3 weeks passed in Chicago's typical November rhythm. The city bundled against the wind that swept off Lake Michigan with teeth sharp enough to cut through the most expensive winter coats. The trees along Michigan Avenue had shed their leaves, leaving skeletal branches that framed the Millennium Tower like delicate pen strokes against the gray sky. Inside the building's climate-controlled perfection, Robert Harris continued his daily routine with the same steady precision that had marked his 17 years of service. But something fundamental had shifted since that morning encounter with Travis Kane and the black card that now lived in his wallet like a small, dark secret. Robert had always possessed an unusual gift for observation, a natural ability to notice the details that others missed or dismissed as unimportant. This talent had served him well in his role as concierge, allowing him to anticipate needs, solve problems before they became crises, and maintain the seamless operation that wealthy residents expected without ever having to think about it. But in the weeks following Kane's casual cruelty, Robert found his attention drawn more specifically toward the penthouse and its owner, as if the black card had somehow sharpened his focus on the man who wielded it like a weapon. Kane's patterns became clearer under this heightened scrutiny. The millionaire left each morning at exactly 8:15, invariably dressed in suits that cost more than most people's cars, carrying himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that money couldn't solve. His destinations varied. Sometimes the gleaming towers of the Loop, where cryptocurrency empires rose and fell on the strength of whispered rumors. Sometimes the exclusive clubs along Lakeshore Drive, where Chicago's financial elite gathered to discuss investments that could reshape entire neighborhoods. But Robert began to notice inconsistencies in Kane's carefully maintained facade. The man who projected such absolute certainty about his wealth and status sometimes returned from these outings with tension written across his features, his jaw clenched in the particular way that suggested problems money couldn't immediately fix. Phone calls overheard in the lobby carried fragments of conversations about market volatility, regulatory concerns, and the kind of financial pressure that would have been invisible to casual observers, but registered clearly to someone who had spent decades reading the subtle signals of human distress. More troubling were Kane's interactions with his son David, a young man in his mid-20s who had been visiting the penthouse with increasing frequency since Robert began paying closer attention. David possessed none of his father's swagger or apparent confidence. Instead, he moved through the world with the careful hesitancy of someone carrying a burden too heavy for his years. Robert had witnessed several of their encounters in the lobby. Brief exchanges marked by David's obvious need for connection, and Kane's equally obvious discomfort with anything that resembled emotional vulnerability. During one particularly tense conversation that Robert pretended not to hear while sorting mail, David's voice carried the desperate edge of someone running out of options. "Dad, please, it's not something we can postpone indefinitely," the young man said, his words careful but urgent. "The doctors say the window for surgery is closing, and without it," Kane's response was swift and brutal in its dismissal. "David, I don't have time for your dramatics right now. Figure it out yourself. You're supposed to be an adult." The conversation ended with Kane's departure for another business meeting, and David standing alone in the lobby, his shoulders shaking with what might have been anger or despair or both. Robert's own life during these weeks took on the quality of careful observation, mixed with growing unease. His evenings in Pilsen became study sessions of sorts, spent researching cryptocurrency markets, investment regulations, and the complex web of financial instruments that men like Kane used to build and maintain their fortunes. The public library's internet access allowed him to explore a world that had previously existed only as abstract concepts, learning about blockchain technology, portfolio diversification, and the kind of high-stakes trading that could create or destroy millions in a matter of hours. What Robert discovered in his research painted a picture of an increasingly unstable financial ecosystem, particularly around cryptocurrency investments. Regulatory bodies were beginning to scrutinize digital assets with uncomfortable intensity, and several high-profile cases of fraud and market manipulation had made investors nervous about the very platforms that had created fortunes like Kane's. The black card in Robert's wallet began to feel less like a symbol of exclusivity and more like evidence of a house of cards built on foundations that might not withstand serious examination. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening in late November, when Robert was walking home through the early darkness that comes with Chicago's winter approach. He had taken a different route that night, following a path through Grant Park that offered a view of the Millennium Tower's upper floors. As he paused to admire the way the building's lights reflected off the lake's dark surface, his attention was caught by unusual activity on the 43rd floor. Kane's penthouse office, normally dark by this hour, glowed with the blue light of multiple computer screens, and Robert could see figures moving back and forth with the kind of urgent energy that suggested crisis management rather than routine business. Curiosity drew Robert closer to the building, not from any desire to spy, but from the same instinct that had made him an exceptional concierge, the ability to sense when something was wrong and might require assistance. Using his employee key card, he entered through the service entrance and made his way up through the back corridors that staff used to move through the building without disturbing residents. The 43rd floor was accessible through a maintenance shaft that Robert had used countless times for routine repairs, and from this vantage point, he could observe Kane's office without being seen. What he witnessed there would have been impossible to understand without the research he'd been conducting over the past weeks. Kane was clearly in crisis mode, surrounded by financial documents, computer screens displaying cryptocurrency trading platforms, and what appeared to be legal paperwork spread across every available surface. The man who had treated Robert with such casual contempt 3 weeks earlier looked haggard, desperate, his expensive suit wrinkled and his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it in obvious frustration. But it was the conversation taking place that truly revealed the scope of Kane's problems. Through the ventilation system that Robert knew intimately from his maintenance duties, he could hear fragments of a phone call that painted a picture of financial disaster disguised as success. Kane was discussing something about offshore accounts, regulatory scrutiny, and the need to move assets before the audit. The words Bitcoin wallet and cryptocurrency laundering appeared multiple times, along with references to fictitious transactions and inflated asset valuations that suggested fraud on a massive scale. Robert remained in his hidden position for nearly an hour, listening to Kane's increasingly desperate attempts to manage what was clearly a criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate investment activity. Phone calls were made to lawyers, accountants, and people identified only by first names who seemed to specialize in the kind of financial maneuvering that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. Throughout it all, Kane's voice carried the particular strain of someone who had built an empire on deception and was now watching it crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The most revealing moment came when Kane made a call to someone he addressed as David's doctor, his voice shifting from frustrated anger to something approaching panic. "No, I can't authorize the procedure right now," Kane said, his words sharp with the kind of cruelty that money often mistakes for strength. "Every asset I have is tied up in investments that I can't liquidate without triggering an investigation." "Tell him he'll have to wait until I sort out this regulatory mess." The doctor's response was apparently unsatisfactory, because Kane's next words were brutal in their dismissal. "I don't care about timelines or medical urgency. Business comes first, and David needs to understand that." Robert felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what he was hearing. Kane's son was facing some kind of medical crisis that required immediate attention, but his father's criminal activities had made it impossible to access the funds needed for treatment. The wealth that Kane wielded like a weapon against people like Robert was apparently as fictional as the man's sense of superiority, built on illegal activities that were now preventing him from helping his own child. The implications of this discovery weighed heavily on Robert as he made his way home that night. The black card in his wallet had become something else entirely, not a symbol of exclusivity, but evidence of a world built on lies, deception, and the kind of moral bankruptcy that no amount of money could disguise. Cain's earlier cruelty now appeared in a different light, not as the confidence of true wealth, but as the desperate posturing of someone whose entire identity depended on maintaining an illusion that was rapidly crumbling. Over the following days, Robert found himself in an impossible position. His natural inclination toward justice warred with his ingrained respect for privacy, and his understanding that involving himself in Cain's affairs could have serious consequences for his own life and livelihood. But David's situation haunted him, a young man trapped by his father's crimes, facing a medical crisis that money existed to solve but couldn't be accessed because of the very illegality that had created it. The solution, when it came to Robert, arrived with the same quiet certainty that had guided his best decisions over the years. He began to document what he had observed, not for revenge or personal gain, but because someone needed to speak for David and for all the other victims of Cain's financial crimes. The black card, originally given as an instrument of humiliation, became Robert's guide to understanding the complex world of cryptocurrency fraud, investment manipulation, and regulatory evasion that Cain had built his fortune upon. Robert's evenings were now spent in careful research and documentation, cross-referencing what he had overheard with publicly available information about Cain's business dealings. The picture that emerged was of systematic fraud spanning several years, involving inflated asset valuations, fictitious cryptocurrency transactions, and the kind of money laundering that used legitimate investment vehicles to hide criminal activity. Cain's presentation of himself as a successful entrepreneur was entirely fabricated, built on stolen money, deceptive practices, and the exploitation of regulatory loopholes that were rapidly being closed by government oversight. The weight of this knowledge sat heavily on Robert's shoulders as he continued his daily duties in the Millennium Tower. Each morning, greeting from Cain now carried additional layers of meaning. The polite exchanges masking Robert's growing understanding of the man's true nature and the scope of his crimes. But perhaps more disturbing was Cain's continued treatment of his son, whose visits to the penthouse became less frequent and more obviously desperate, as whatever medical condition he was facing apparently worsened without proper treatment. The crisis that would change everything for both men was still weeks away, building slowly like a storm system gathering strength over Lake Michigan. But Robert could feel its approach in the increasing tension that surrounded Cain's daily activities, in the longer hours spent in his office engaged in damage control, and in the growing desperation that marked his phone conversations with lawyers and financial advisors. The black card in Robert's wallet had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder that dignity and truth possessed power that no amount of stolen money could match, and that sometimes the greatest strength came from being underestimated by people too blinded by their own arrogance to recognize real wisdom when it stood quietly before them. December arrived in Chicago like an unwelcome visitor, bringing with it the kind of bitter cold that seemed to seep through even the most expensive winter coats and settle deep in the bones of anyone foolish enough to venture outside. The Millennium Tower stood like a gleaming fortress against the harsh weather, its heated lobby a sanctuary where Chicago's wealthy residents could pretend that natural forces and seasonal changes were problems for other people to endure. But inside the building's climate-controlled perfection, Robert Harris could sense the gathering storm that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the complex web of lies and criminal activity that he had discovered living in the penthouse 43 floors above his modest desk. The morning of December 15th began like any other, with Robert arriving an hour before his official shift to ensure that everything was perfect for the residents who would soon emerge from their expensive cocoons to face another day of important meetings and significant decisions. He had pressed his uniform with extra care that morning, polished his shoes until they gleamed, and prepared himself mentally for what had become the increasingly complex task of maintaining professional composure while possessing knowledge that could destroy the man who treated him with such casual contempt. Travis Kane emerged from his private elevator at exactly 8:15, as had become his pattern, but Robert noticed immediately that something fundamental had changed in the millionaire's appearance and demeanor. The expensive suit was the same. The Italian leather shoes still clicked with their familiar authority against the marble floor, but Kane's face carried the pallor of someone who had not been sleeping well, and his eyes held the darting quality of prey animal sensing nearby predators. The supreme confidence that had marked his previous interactions with Robert had been replaced by something that looked very much like barely controlled panic. "Good morning, Mr. Kane," Robert said with his usual professional courtesy, his voice carrying no hint of the knowledge that sat like a weight in his chest. Kane's response was curt to the point of rudeness, a barely acknowledged grunt that suggested his mind was occupied with problems far more pressing than social niceties with building staff. He paused at Robert's desk, his manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood surface with the nervous energy of someone fighting to maintain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. "Robert," Kane said suddenly, his voice carrying an edge that Robert had never heard before, sharp with something that might have been desperation disguised as authority. "I need to ask you about building security, specifically about who has access to what areas and how information moves through this place." The question was phrased as casual inquiry, but Robert's years of observation had taught him to read the subtext beneath seemingly simple requests. Kane wasn't asking about security. He was trying to determine whether his criminal activities had been observed or documented by anyone who might pose a threat to his increasingly precarious situation. "Security is very tight here, Mr. Kane," Robert replied carefully, maintaining the same neutral tone he had perfected over 17 years of interactions with residents who ranged from occasionally kind to routinely dismissive. "Building staff have access only to areas necessary for our duties, and we all understand the importance of respecting residents' privacy." The answer was truthful as far as it went, but it didn't address the more complex reality that maintenance duties and emergency protocols had given Robert access to information that Kane clearly hoped remained secret. Kane's relief at this response was visible but brief, quickly replaced by the kind of calculating look that successful criminals develop when trying to determine whether they've been discovered. "Good, that's good," he said, but his voice carried undertones that suggested nothing about his current situation felt particularly good. "Because privacy is essential in my line of work. Cryptocurrency investments, high-level financial planning, the kind of business that requires absolute discretion." He paused, studying Robert's face as if searching for signs of comprehension or suspicion. "I trust you understand the importance of keeping building operations completely separate from residents' professional activities." "Of course, Mr. Kane," Robert responded, though he wondered if Kane realized how much his nervousness was revealing about the true nature of those professional activities. "We pride ourselves on discretion here." The conversation might have ended there, another brief interaction between wealthy resident and invisible service provider, but Kane seemed unable to leave without making one more attempt to establish his dominance over someone he still perceived as fundamentally powerless. "You know, Robert," Kane said, his voice shifting back toward the cruel amusement that had marked their previous encounters, "I've been thinking about our conversation last month, about what someone like you would do with real money." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew another black card, identical to the one he had given Robert weeks earlier. "I had another one of these made up. Thought you might enjoy carrying it around, pretending to be someone who matters in the financial world." The gesture was meant to be humiliating, Kane's way of reasserting psychological control during a period when his actual control over his criminal empire was clearly slipping. But Robert accepted the second card with the same quiet dignity that had marked his response to the first, slipping it into his shirt pocket without comment or visible reaction. Kane seemed frustrated by this calm acceptance, having clearly hoped for some display of gratitude or resentment that would restore his sense of superiority over someone he needed to remain invisible and inconsequential. "That's two now," Kane said with forced joviality, his laughter carrying an edge of hysteria that probably only Robert was positioned to recognize. "Maybe you can start your own investment club for concierges and janitors. Discuss your cryptocurrency portfolios over coffee in the break room." The cruelty was sharper than before, tinged with the particular viciousness that fear often brings out in people accustomed to wielding power without consequence. Robert nodded politely and returned to sorting the morning mail, giving Kane the opportunity to make his exit with whatever dignity remained available to him. But as the millionaire walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against marble with less authority than usual, Robert noticed something that Kane probably didn't realize he was revealing. The man's hands were shaking slightly, barely perceptible tremors that spoke to stress levels incompatible with the image of supreme confidence he was working so hard to maintain. The significance of this second black card didn't become clear until that evening, when Robert was walking home through the December cold that turned his breath into visible clouds and made the lights of the Millennium Tower seem impossibly distant behind him. Curiosity prompted him to examine the new card more carefully than he had the first, and what he discovered changed everything about his understanding of Kane's recent behavior and growing desperation. Unlike the first card, which had been legitimate, an actual membership card to an exclusive investment club, this second card was a fake, a carefully constructed replica that would fool casual observation but wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. More importantly, the card contained subtle markings that Robert recognized from his research into Kane's business activities. It was essentially a sample of the kind of fraudulent documentation that Kane had been using to create the illusion of legitimate wealth and exclusive access to high-level investment opportunities. Kane hadn't given Robert this card as another gesture of cruel amusement. He had done it because he was practicing, perfecting the creation of false credentials that might be necessary for whatever escape plan he was developing, as his criminal enterprise crumbled under increasing regulatory scrutiny. Robert had become, without realizing it, an unwitting test case for forgeries that Kane might need to use if his situation became desperate enough to require new identity documents or fraudulent investment credentials. This realization transformed Robert's understanding of his role in the unfolding drama. He was no longer simply a victim of Kane's casual cruelty or an accidental witness to financial crimes. He had become, whether Kane realized it or not, a potential threat to plans that probably involved fleeing the country before federal investigators could build a strong enough case to ensure conviction and asset forfeiture. The black cards in Robert's wallet weren't just symbols of wealth he would never possess. They were evidence of crimes that could send Kane to federal prison for decades. Over the following days, Robert observed Kane's behavior with the heightened awareness of someone who finally understood the true stakes of the situation. The millionaire's pattern of leaving the building each morning remained consistent, but his destinations had clearly changed. Instead of heading toward the financial district for legitimate business meetings, Kane now seemed to spend most of his time meeting with lawyers, accountants, and the kind of financial consultants who specialized in helping wealthy criminals protect their assets from government seizure. More troubling were the changes in Kane's treatment of his son David, whose medical situation appeared to be deteriorating rapidly. The young man's visits to the penthouse became increasingly urgent and increasingly brief, his conversations with his father marked by desperation on one side and cold calculations on the other. During one particularly heartbreaking exchange that Robert witnessed in the lobby, David's voice broke with exhaustion and pain as he explained that his doctors had given him a deadline, surgery within the next 2 weeks, or the opportunity would be lost permanently. Kane's response revealed the depth of his moral bankruptcy with brutal clarity. "David, "I've explained this before," he said, his voice carrying the impatient tone of someone discussing a minor inconvenience rather than his child's life. "Every dollar I have is tied up in investments that can't be liquidated without triggering regulatory attention. Once I get through this current audit situation, we can discuss medical financing." The words were delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had long ago learned to prioritize money over human relationships, including the most fundamental bond between parent and child. Robert watched David leave the building that day with the broken posture of someone who had finally understood that blood relationship meant nothing compared to criminal self-preservation. The young man's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs as he pushed through the lobby's heavy glass doors into the December cold, abandoning hope that his father might choose family over the fortune built on lies and stolen money. That night, alone in his small apartment in Pilsen, Robert sat at his kitchen table, examining the 2 black cards Kane had given him, seeing them now not as symbols of wealth and exclusivity, but as evidence of systematic fraud and the particular kind of evil that comes disguised as success. The weight of what he knew pressed down on him like the winter sky over Lake Michigan, heavy with the promise of storms that would reshape everything in their path. The moral equation was becoming clear, though the practical choices remained complex. Kane's crimes extended far beyond financial fraud. They now included the deliberate sacrifice of his own son's health and possibly his life in service of criminal self-preservation. David was dying because his father had built a fortune on lies and couldn't access legitimate funds without revealing the extent of his illegal activities. Justice demanded action, but the kind of action that could destroy both the criminal and potentially the innocent victim he was already destroying through neglect. Robert understood that he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just the remainder of his own life, but possibly the survival of a young man whose only crime was being born to someone who valued money and secrecy more than basic human decency. The black cards in his possession were more than evidence now. They were keys to a kind of justice that would require courage, intelligence, and the willingness to risk everything he had built over 17 years of quiet, dignified service. The winter wind rattled the windows of his apartment as Robert made the decision that would transform him from invisible observer to active agent of moral reckoning. Kane's cruelty had been casual, almost thoughtless in its assumption of superiority and entitlement. But Robert's response would be anything but casual. It would be carefully planned, methodically executed, and aimed not at revenge, but at the kind of justice that sometimes requires ordinary people to take extraordinary risks in service of what is right. Chicago's winter deepened as January arrived with the kind of bitter cold that transforms the city into a crystalline landscape of ice and snow, each breath visible in the air like the ghosts of words unspoken. The Millennium Tower stood defiantly against the harsh weather, its heated lobby a testament to the power of wealth to insulate its possessors from the natural forces that governed less fortunate lives. But inside the building's climate-controlled perfection, Robert Harris worked with the methodical precision of someone who had finally found a purpose worthy of the risks it demanded. His quiet daily routine now serving as cover for an investigation that would have impressed federal law enforcement agents with its thoroughness and attention to detail. The transformation in Travis Kane's behavior had become impossible to ignore, even for residents who normally paid no attention to the emotional states of their building's concierge or each other. The man who had once moved through the lobby with the supreme confidence of someone who owned not just his penthouse but everyone and everything beneath it now displayed the nervous energy of prey animal sensing nearby predators. His expensive suits hung differently on his frame, as if the weight of his crimes had somehow altered his physical presence, and his eyes held the darting quality of someone constantly calculating escape routes and potential threats. Kane's morning routine remained consistent in its timing, but had changed dramatically in its purpose. Instead of leaving the building at 8:15 for legitimate business meetings in the financial district, He now spent his days consulting with criminal defense attorneys, forensic accountants specializing in cryptocurrency fraud, and the kind of financial consultants who advertised their services in coded language that promised asset protection from government seizure. Robert had become expert at reading the subtle signs that revealed the true nature of these appointments, the particular tension in Kane's shoulders when he returned from meetings with lawyers, the way his hands shook slightly after phone conversations with what were clearly federal investigators, the increasing desperation that marked his interactions with anyone who might possess information about his crimes. But it was Kane's treatment of his son, David, that had pushed Robert from passive observation to active investigation. The young man's medical crisis had worsened dramatically over the past month, his visits to the penthouse now marked by a physical frailty that broke Robert's heart and strengthened his resolve. David's conversations with his father had taken on the quality of deathbed pleas, desperate attempts to reach whatever humanity might still exist beneath Kane's criminal obsessions. During one particularly devastating exchange that Robert witnessed while pretending to organize the lobby's magazine display, David's voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had accepted that his father would choose money over his life. "Dad, the doctors say I have maybe 2 weeks before the surgery becomes impossible," the young man said, his words careful but urgent. "After that, it's just palliative care until—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Kane showed no hesitation in responding with the cold calculation that had apparently replaced whatever paternal instincts he might once have possessed. "David, you need to understand the bigger picture here," Kane replied, his voice carrying the impatient tone of someone discussing a minor inconvenience rather than his child's survival. "Everything I've built is under attack right now. Federal investigators, regulatory audits, cryptocurrency forensic specialists, they're all trying to destroy what took me years to create. I can't liquidate assets for medical expenses when doing so would expose me to criminal charges that could mean decades in federal prison." The words revealed Kane's true priorities with brutal clarity. His criminal empire mattered more than his son's life, his freedom more than his child's survival. Robert watched David leave the building that day, knowing he would probably never see the young man alive again, unless something fundamental changed in the equation that balanced Kane's criminal self-preservation against basic human decency. The decision to intervene was no longer a matter of choice. It had become a moral imperative that no amount of personal risk could justify avoiding. The investigation that Robert had been conducting in his spare time now became his primary focus, transforming his evenings into intensive research sessions that gradually revealed the full scope of Kane's criminal activities. Using the public computers at the Chicago Public Library and carefully applied technical skills he had developed over decades of maintaining building security systems, Robert began mapping the complex web of fraud, money laundering, and cryptocurrency manipulation that Kane had used to build his fictional fortune. The black cards Kane had given him proved to be more valuable than either man had initially realized. The first card, legitimate but carrying traces of Kane's fingerprints and DNA, provided Robert with concrete evidence linking the millionaire to the exclusive investment club that prosecutors could prove he had no legal right to access. The second card, a carefully constructed fake, revealed the sophisticated forgery operation that Kane was clearly planning to use in whatever escape scenario he was developing as federal investigators closed in on his activities. But Robert's most significant discovery came through his intimate knowledge of the Millennium Tower's internal systems. As building concierge, he had access to maintenance areas, utility closures, and service corridors that Kane assumed were invisible to residents and irrelevant to security concerns. These spaces, however, contained the building's central server room, telecommunications hub, and security system controls, all of which Kane had been using to support his criminal activities without realizing that someone with Robert's access and technical knowledge could monitor every digital transaction he made from the penthouse. Working carefully and methodically, Robert documented months of illegal cryptocurrency transfers, fraudulent investment reports, and money laundering operations that Cain had been conducting through servers he thought were secure and private. The technical complexity of the crimes was matched only by their scope. Cain had stolen millions of dollars from legitimate investors, created fictional cryptocurrency portfolios to inflate his apparent net worth, and used sophisticated blockchain manipulation to hide the movement of funds through offshore accounts and shell companies. More damning was Robert's discovery of Cain's contingency plans for fleeing the country before federal prosecutors could file formal charges. The penthouse contained detailed escape routes, false identification documents, and financial instruments that would allow Cain to access hidden assets from countries without extradition treaties with the United States. The man who had treated Robert with such casual contempt was planning to abandon his dying son and flee to a life of luxury built on stolen money and the suffering of his victims. The moral weight of this knowledge pressed on Robert like the winter sky over Chicago, heavy with the promise of storms that would reshape everything in their path. But alongside the burden came a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt since Maria's death. The recognition that his years of invisible service had positioned him uniquely to serve justice in a way that no federal agent or prosecutor could match. He knew Cain's patterns, understood his psychology, and possessed access to evidence that formal investigations might take years to uncover. The plan that Robert developed over the following weeks was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. Rather than turning his evidence over to federal authorities who might spend months building a case while David died and Cain potentially escaped, Robert would use Cain's own arrogance and cruelty against him in a way that would expose his crimes, save his son's life, and deliver the kind of justice that sometimes required ordinary people to take extraordinary risks. The first phase involved creating a comprehensive dossier of Cain's criminal activities, organized in a way that would be immediately comprehensible to federal prosecutors, financial regulators, and the media outlets that would eventually expose the full scope of the fraud. Robert worked with the patience and attention to detail that had made him an exceptional concierge, ensuring that every piece of evidence was documented, verified, and presented in a format that would survive legal challenges and support successful prosecution. The second phase was more complex and morally ambiguous, requiring Robert to use Cain's desperate need to maintain his criminal secrecy as leverage to force him to provide medical treatment for David. This would involve a careful balance of revelation and concealment, showing Cain enough evidence to prove that his crimes had been discovered while keeping enough in reserve to ensure his cooperation, rather than triggering the flight response that would leave David to die alone and penniless. The final phase would deliver complete justice through exposure of Cain's crimes to federal authorities, but only after David's medical needs had been addressed and the young man's survival ensured. This represented a kind of moral calculation that Robert had never imagined himself making, using temporary concealment of criminal activity to save a life, while ensuring that the criminal eventually faced appropriate consequences for his actions. As February arrived in Chicago with the promise of eventual spring but the reality of continued winter, Robert prepared for a confrontation that would transform him from invisible building employee to active agent of justice. The black cards in his wallet had become talismans of sorts, reminders that dignity and truth possessed power that no amount of stolen money could match. Cain's casual cruelty had been delivered with the assumption that people like Robert were powerless to respond effectively. But Robert understood something that Cain's arrogance had blinded him to. Sometimes the greatest power belonged to those who were systematically underestimated, and sometimes the most effective justice came from the quiet actions of ordinary people who refused to let evil triumph simply because it wore expensive suits and lived in penthouses high above the city. The confrontation was coming, as inevitable as the changing seasons and as certain as the moral laws that Cain had spent years believing his wealth could somehow suspend or circumvent. Robert Harris, concierge and keeper of secrets, was about to remind a cruel millionaire that some truths were too powerful to remain hidden and some injustices too profound to go unanswered. February's grip on Chicago loosened gradually, the bitter cold giving way to the kind of gray slush that marked the city's reluctant transition toward spring. But inside the Millennium Tower, the seasonal change felt more like the calm before a devastating storm. As Robert Harris prepared for a confrontation that would transform both his life and the carefully constructed criminal empire that Travis Kane had built in the penthouse 43 floors above the marble lobby, where truth and lies would finally collide with the force of 17 years of accumulated injustice and quiet moral authority. The morning of February 21st arrived with the kind of overcast sky that seemed to press down on the city like a gray blanket, filtering the daylight into something pale and uncertain that matched Robert's emotional state as he prepared for work with unusual care. He had pressed his uniform twice, polished his shoes until they gleamed like mirrors, and spent extra time ensuring that every detail of his appearance reflected the dignity and professionalism that would be essential for what he planned to accomplish during what might be his last day as the building's concierge. Kane emerged from his private elevator at exactly 8:15, as had become his rigid pattern, but Robert noticed immediately that the millionaire's deterioration had accelerated dramatically over the past week. The expensive suit hung on Kane's frame like clothes borrowed from a larger man. His face had acquired the pallor of someone who no longer slept well, and his eyes held the darting quality of prey animal that had finally realized the hunters were closing in from multiple directions. Federal investigators had apparently intensified their scrutiny of his cryptocurrency activities. Regulatory agencies were demanding documentation that Kane couldn't provide without exposing his crimes, and the stress of maintaining multiple lies while planning his escape from justice had begun to show in ways that even his considerable wealth couldn't disguise. "Good morning, Mr. Kane," Robert said with his usual professional courtesy. But this time, his voice carried undertones that a man in Kane's psychological state couldn't help but notice. Something deeper than politeness, more substantial than the usual invisible service that Kane had come to expect from building staff. Kane paused at Robert's desk, his manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood surface with the nervous energy of someone fighting to maintain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. "Robert," Kane said, his voice carrying an edge that mixed desperation with the remnants of his habitual arrogance, "I need to discuss building security again. Specifically, I need to know if anyone has been asking questions about penthouse activities or showing unusual interest in my business affairs." The question was phrased as a routine inquiry, but Robert could hear the fear beneath Kane's carefully controlled tone. Fear that his crimes had been discovered by someone who might pose a threat to his increasingly desperate plans for avoiding prosecution. Robert had been preparing for this moment for weeks, anticipating that Kane's growing paranoia would eventually lead to direct questions about building security and information access. The response he had crafted was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously: provide Kane with enough information to prevent immediate flight, establish Robert's knowledge of the criminal activities without triggering violent defensive reactions, and create the psychological foundation for the negotiation that would determine whether David lived or died while his father faced justice. "Mr. Kane," Robert said carefully, maintaining the same neutral tone that had served him well through 17 years of interactions with difficult residents, "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about building security. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable discussing these matters in your office, where we can speak privately about the specific concerns you mentioned." The suggestion was delivered with the kind of professional deference that Kane expected from building staff, but the subtext was clear to both men. Robert possessed knowledge that required privacy to discuss safely. Kane's relief at finding someone willing to engage with his security concerns was immediately complicated by suspicion about why the building's concierge would suggest a private meeting about matters that should have been routine building management issues. "My office?" Kane repeated, his voice revealing uncertainty about whether Robert's suggestion represented an opportunity for assistance or a trap that he wasn't sophisticated enough to recognize. I suppose that would be appropriate, given the sensitive nature of my business activities. I'll come up during my lunch break, Robert replied, making it clear that this meeting would take place outside his official duties and would therefore carry different expectations about confidentiality and professional boundaries. Say, 12:30, that should give us adequate privacy for the kind of conversation you seem to need. Kane agreed with the nervous energy of someone who desperately needed allies, but couldn't risk trusting anyone completely, his paranoia warring with his practical need for information about potential threats to his criminal enterprise. The hours between this exchange and the scheduled meeting passed like a slow countdown to an explosion whose destructive force Robert could calculate but not completely predict. He continued his daily duties with mechanical precision, sorting mail and greeting residents while his mind focused on the complex negotiation he was about to undertake. A careful balance of revelation and concealment designed to save David's life, while ensuring that Kane eventually faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. At exactly 12:30, Robert took the private elevator to the 43rd floor for the first time in his 17-year tenure at the Millennium Tower. Kane's penthouse was a monument to stolen wealth, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Chicago that seemed to suggest ownership of the entire city. Expensive art covered the walls. Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries lay scattered across hardwood floors that gleamed like mirrors, and every surface displayed the kind of luxury that only criminal levels of wealth could support. Khan was waiting in his office, surrounded by the detritus of his criminal empire, computers displaying cryptocurrency trading platforms, legal documents spread across his desk, and the kind of financial paperwork that suggested desperate attempts to hide assets from federal investigators. The man who had treated Robert with such casual contempt for years now looked up with the desperate hope of someone who had finally realized he needed help from the very people he had spent so long despising. "Robert," Kane said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and residual arrogance, "I'm glad you're here. I need to understand exactly what kind of security risks the building might pose to my business activities. Specifically, I need to know if anyone has access to information about penthouse communications, financial transactions, or private meetings." The questions revealed Kane's growing awareness that his criminal activities might have been observed, but also his continued assumption that someone like Robert couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated nature of cryptocurrency fraud and money laundering. Robert had anticipated this opening and had prepared a response that would accomplish his primary objectives while maintaining Kane's psychological comfort level. "Mr. Kane," he said quietly, setting a manila folder on the desk between them with the deliberate precision of someone dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game, "I think you should look at this before we discuss building security any further." Kane opened the folder with the wary curiosity of someone who suspected he was about to receive bad news, but couldn't resist learning its exact nature. What he found inside transformed his expression from nervous confidence to absolute terror in the space of seconds. Comprehensive documentation of his cryptocurrency frauds, money laundering operations, and illegal asset transfers, organized with the kind of professional competence that federal prosecutors would have envied. "Where did you get this?" Kane whispered, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who had just realized that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse completely. "How could you possibly know about any of this?" The questions revealed his fundamental inability to understand that people he considered invisible might possess intelligence, technical skills, and moral authority sufficient to expose crimes he thought were hidden beyond discovery. "Mr. Kane," Robert replied with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through years of casual humiliation and dismissal, "I know about your criminal activities because I see everything that happens in this building. I know about the stolen millions, The fraudulent cryptocurrency portfolios, the money laundering operations you've been running through building servers that you thought were private and secure. He paused, allowing Cain to absorb the scope of his exposure before continuing with the moral authority of someone who had finally found a purpose worthy of significant personal risk. More importantly, Robert continued, his voice strengthening with each word, I know about your son David, about his medical condition, about the surgery he needs to survive, and about your decision to let him die rather than access the stolen money that could save his life. The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reshape everything in their widening circles. Cain's response revealed the moral bankruptcy that Robert had suspected, but never fully comprehended. You don't understand the complexities involved here, he said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone trying to rationalize the irrationalizable. Those funds are tied up in investments that can't be liquidated without exposing me to criminal prosecution. David's medical expenses would require accessing accounts that federal investigators are already monitoring. I can't save him without destroying myself. Robert felt something cold settle in his chest as he realized that Cain was genuinely prepared to let his son die rather than face the consequences of his criminal activities. The conversation had revealed not just systematic fraud, but a level of moral corruption that made Cain's casual cruelty toward building staff seem almost insignificant by comparison. But it had also created the opening that Robert needed to accomplish his primary objective, saving David's life while ensuring that Cain eventually faced justice for his crimes. Mr. Cain, Robert said carefully, his words carrying the weight of someone who held another person's fate in his hands. I'm going to offer you a choice that you probably don't deserve, but that your son certainly needs. He paused, allowing the implications to settle before continuing with the kind of moral authority that 17 years of dignified service had earned him. You're going to arrange for David's surgery immediately, using whatever resources are necessary to ensure his survival. In return, I'm going to give you 48 hours to put your affairs in order before I turn this evidence over to federal authorities. The proposal was elegant in its moral clarity and devastating in its practical implications. Cain would be forced to choose between his stolen wealth and his child's life, between criminal self-preservation and basic human decency. More importantly, Robert would ensure that justice was served regardless of Cain's decision. David would receive medical treatment either through his father's cooperation or through Robert's own resources, and Cain would face prosecution either immediately or after a brief delay that might allow him to make whatever peace was possible with the son he had been prepared to sacrifice. Cain's response revealed the depth of his desperation and the residual traces of whatever humanity might still exist beneath his criminal persona. 48 hours, he repeated, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone trying to process information too overwhelming to fully comprehend. You're giving me 48 hours to save my son's life and destroy everything I've spent years building? The question contained its own answer, revealing Cain's recognition that he had indeed spent years building something that deserved destruction, and that his son's life was worth whatever price justice might demand. I'm giving you 48 hours to do what you should have done months ago, Robert replied with quiet finality, rising from his chair with the dignity of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. Your son is dying because of your crimes, Mr. Cain. That's a choice you made when you decided that stolen money mattered more than his life. Now I'm giving you the opportunity to make a different choice, probably the last opportunity he'll have. As Robert left the penthouse and descended 43 floors to the marble lobby that had been his domain for so many years, he carried with him the satisfaction of someone who had finally refused to remain invisible in the face of evil. Cain's response to the ultimatum would determine not just David's survival, but the form that justice would take in the complex moral equation that wealth and poverty, cruelty and dignity had created between them. The next 48 hours would transform both men forever, though in ways that neither could yet fully anticipate or understand. The 48 hours that followed Robert's ultimatum passed like a slow-motion explosion, spreading through the carefully ordered world of the Millennium Tower, each moment carrying the weight of consequences that would reshape lives and reveal the true character of men who had spent years hiding behind facades of wealth and humble service. Chicago's late February sky remained gray and overcast, as if the city itself was holding its breath, while moral forces too powerful to resist gathered strength for the final confrontation between justice and the particular kind of evil that wears expensive suits and speaks in the language of legitimate business. Kane's response to Robert's ultimatum began within hours of their penthouse meeting, though not in the way that either man had anticipated. Rather than immediately arranging for David's medical treatment or preparing to flee the country, Kane spent the first day in a state of psychological paralysis that revealed the fundamental weakness beneath his carefully maintained facade of criminal competence. Robert observed the millionaire's movements from his position at the concierge desk, noting the way Kane paced the lobby like a caged animal, making and canceling appointments with lawyers, starting phone conversations that ended abruptly in frustrated silence, and displaying the kind of nervous energy that suggested complete psychological breakdown rather than criminal mastermind, calculating his next strategic move. But by the morning of the second day, Kane had apparently decided on a course of action that combined desperate self-preservation with what might have been genuine concern for his son's survival. Robert watched from across the lobby as Kane made a lengthy phone call to what was clearly a medical facility, his voice carrying the urgent tone of someone arranging emergency procedures while trying to avoid questions about payment methods or insurance verification. The conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes and ended with Kane's shoulders sagging in relief that suggested David's surgery had finally been scheduled. The relief was short-lived, however, as Kane's next series of phone calls revealed the true complexity of his psychological and moral position. Robert could hear fragments of conversations with criminal defense attorneys, cryptocurrency experts specializing in asset hiding, and the kind of financial consultants who advertised their services in coded language that promised protection from federal prosecution. Kane was clearly trying to arrange David's medical treatment while simultaneously preparing to flee the country before federal authorities could file formal charges, a dual strategy that revealed both residual parental concern and continued commitment to criminal self-preservation. The moral tension inherent in this situation came to a head on the afternoon of the second day, when David arrived at the building for what both men seemed to understand might be their final conversation. Robert observed the reunion from his position behind the concierge desk, pretending to organize mail while actually witnessing a scene that would have challenged the dramatic capabilities of professional actors. David, clearly weakened by months of delayed medical treatment, moved with the careful precision of someone whose body was failing, but whose spirit remained strong enough to demand answers from the father who had terrorized his survival with criminal priorities. "Dad," David said, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who had accepted that he might be speaking to his father for the last time. "The doctors say the surgery is scheduled for tonight, that someone has arranged payment, and that everything is finally in place." He paused, studying Kane's face, as if searching for signs of humanity beneath the criminal persona that had dominated their relationship for so many years. "I need to know, did you finally choose to save me, or did someone else force you to do the right thing?" Kane's response revealed the moral complexity of someone who had spent so long justifying criminal behavior that he could no longer distinguish between genuine virtue and strategic necessity. "David," he said carefully, his words carrying the weight of someone trying to redeem years of failed parenthood with a single conversation. "I've allocated the resources necessary for your treatment. The specific details of how those resources became available aren't important compared to ensuring your survival." The answer was technically accurate, but morally evasive. avoiding the central question of whether Cain's decision had been motivated by love or fear of exposure and prosecution. David's reaction suggested that he understood exactly what his father's evasiveness revealed about the true nature of their relationship and the forces that had finally compelled Cain to provide life-saving medical treatment. "Someone found out about your crimes, didn't they?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the tired wisdom of someone who had spent years watching his father prioritize money over family relationships. "Someone forced you to choose between your stolen wealth and my life, and you would have let me die if the choice had been entirely yours." The accuracy of David's assessment was confirmed by Cain's inability to respond with anything resembling genuine denial or moral outrage. Instead, he offered the kind of weak justification that criminals often mistake for ethical reasoning. "The situation is more complex than you understand, David. Federal investigations, regulatory scrutiny, asset forfeiture possibilities. There are factors involved here that go beyond simple family finances." The words revealed Cain's continued inability to understand that no criminal complication could justify allowing his son to die, that basic human decency demanded placing family survival above personal legal consequences. Robert remained at his desk throughout this exchange, maintaining the appearance of routine work while actually serving as witness to a conversation that would define the moral legacy of both men. David's response to his father's justifications carried the devastating clarity of someone who had finally understood the true nature of the person who had brought him into the world. "Dad, you're a criminal who was prepared to let me die rather than face the consequences of your crimes. Someone else, someone with actual moral authority, had to force you to save my life. That's not complex family dynamics. That's evil, disguised as sophisticated business thinking." The word evil hung between father and son like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of truth finally spoken after years of careful avoidance and polite fiction. Cain's face went white at hearing himself described in language that no amount of wealth or criminal sophistication could soften or rationalize away. "David, that's not fair," he said weakly, his voice carrying the hollow protest of someone whose moral position was too compromised to defend effectively. "I've provided for you, supported your education, given you opportunities that most people never have access to." "You've provided for me with stolen money," David replied with quiet finality, "and when providing for me required risking your criminal empire, you chose the empire. Someone else chose to save my life, Dad, not you." He turned away from his father with the deliberate precision of someone severing a relationship that had become too toxic to survive, walking toward the lobby's exit with the careful dignity of someone whose physical weakness couldn't diminish his moral strength. Cain called after his son with the desperate voice of someone realizing that wealth and power meant nothing compared to the love he had systematically destroyed through years of criminal priorities. "David, wait. We can discuss this after your surgery, when you're feeling stronger and can understand the complexities involved in protecting our family's financial future." But David continued walking without turning back, leaving Cain alone in the marble lobby with only Robert as witness to the complete collapse of whatever family relationships his crimes had left intact. The silence that followed David's departure felt heavy with the weight of justice finally approaching its inevitable conclusion. Within hours, Cain would have to decide whether to honor his son's medical arrangements and then flee the country, or remain in Chicago to face federal prosecution while attempting to rebuild some semblance of relationship with the son he had nearly sacrificed to criminal self-preservation. Robert understood that his ultimatum had created a situation where Cain could no longer avoid the moral consequences of his actions, where wealth and sophisticated criminal planning couldn't protect him from the basic human requirement to choose between good and evil. That evening, as David's surgery began at Chicago Memorial Hospital, Robert received a phone call that confirmed both the success of his intervention and the final chapter of Cain's criminal career. The voice on the other end belonged to a federal prosecutor who had been building a case against Kane for months and who had just received an anonymous package containing comprehensive documentation of cryptocurrency fraud, money laundering, and asset manipulation that would ensure successful prosecution even if Kane attempted to flee the jurisdiction. "Mr. Harris," the prosecutor said, her voice carrying the professional satisfaction of someone whose long investigation had finally received the evidence necessary for conviction, "I understand that you may have information relevant to our investigation of Travis Kane's financial crimes. Would you be willing to serve as a witness in federal court?" Robert's agreement to testify was delivered with the same quiet dignity that had sustained him through 17 years of invisible service. But now that dignity would finally be recognized by a system of justice that valued truth over wealth, character over criminal sophistication. As midnight approached and David's surgery continued successfully in an operating room paid for by funds that Kane could no longer keep secret from federal investigators, Robert sat in his small apartment in Pilsen, considering the transformation that 48 hours had brought to all their lives. Kane's criminal empire was finished, his relationship with his son permanently damaged by moral choices that no amount of future wealth could undo. But David would live, justice would be served, and the quiet dignity of honest service had finally proven more powerful than the cruel arrogance of stolen wealth. The city of Chicago slept under its gray February sky while forces of justice and moral reckoning continued their ancient work of separating right from wrong, wealth from worth, and the temporary power of criminal success from the permanent authority of truth, finally spoken by someone who had spent too many years invisible but had never stopped seeing everything. Spring arrived in Chicago with the gradual certainty of natural law overcoming artificial resistance, the bitter cold giving way to mild days that promised renewal and transformation for a city that had weathered another difficult winter. But for Robert Harris, standing once again behind the familiar wooden desk in the Millennium Tower's marble lobby, the seasonal change felt less significant than the human transformation that had occurred during the 48 hours when moral courage had finally confronted criminal arrogance and emerged victorious in ways that no one could have anticipated. 3 months had passed since David's successful surgery and Kane's subsequent arrest on federal charges that included cryptocurrency fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud across multiple states. The penthouse on the 43rd floor stood empty now, its expensive furnishings seized by federal marshals as evidence of proceeds from criminal activity, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of a city that Kane would not see again as a free man for decades to come. The building's atmosphere had changed in subtle but measurable ways, as if the removal of such concentrated evil had allowed decent people to breathe more easily and move through their daily lives without the unconscious burden of proximity to systematic moral corruption. Robert had testified before a federal grand jury with the same quiet dignity that had marked his 17 years of service to the building's residents, his detailed knowledge of Kane's activities proving devastating to any hope of plea bargaining or reduced sentences. The black cards that Kane had given him as instruments of humiliation had become key pieces of evidence in a prosecution that would be studied by law enforcement agencies as an example of how sophisticated financial crimes could be exposed through the careful observations of ordinary people who had been systematically underestimated by the criminals they served. But the most significant change in Robert's life came not from his role in exposing Kane's crimes, but from a conversation he had received 3 weeks after testifying. When David called from his hospital room to request a meeting that would reshape both their understanding of justice, family, and the kind of moral inheritance that transcends biological relationships. "Mr. Harris," David had said, his voice still weak from surgery but carrying the clear tone of someone whose physical recovery had been matched by moral clarity about his family's past and his own future. "I need to thank you for saving my life. But more than that, I need to understand why you chose to help someone whose father had treated you so badly for so many years." The question revealed David's struggle to comprehend the kind of moral reasoning that would motivate a virtual stranger to take enormous personal risks to save someone he barely knew. Their meeting took place in the same marble lobby where Cain had delivered his casual cruelties, but the atmosphere was transformed by the absence of criminal pressure and the presence of genuine moral connection between two people who had both been damaged by Cain's choices in different but significant ways. David moved carefully, his recovery still incomplete, but his eyes held the clarity of someone who had survived not just medical crisis, but the moral collapse of the family structure that had defined his entire life. "Mr. Harris," David said as they sat together in the lobby's comfortable seating area, "my father stole millions of dollars from innocent investors, laundered money through criminal organizations, and was prepared to let me die rather than risk exposing his illegal activities to federal authorities." He paused, gathering strength for words that clearly demanded considerable emotional courage. "But you risked your job, your safety, and your future to save the life of someone whose family had caused you nothing but humiliation and dismissal. I need to understand what kind of person makes that choice." Robert's response carried the weight of moral authority earned through decades of quiet dignity in the face of systematic disrespect. "David, I didn't save your life because of who your father was or what he had done to me. I saved your life because you were innocent, because you were dying, and because I had the knowledge and opportunity to help. That's not complicated moral reasoning. That's just basic human decency applied to circumstances where it was needed." The simplicity of Robert's explanation seemed to overwhelm David, whose experience with family relationships had taught him to expect complex motivations, hidden agendas, and calculations of personal benefit underlying any apparently generous action. "But my father treated you terribly," he said, his voice carrying the confusion of someone trying to understand behavior that contradicted everything his upbringing had taught him about human nature. "He humiliated you, dismissed you, acted as if your years of service meant nothing. Most people would have wanted revenge, not to save the life of his son." "Your father's treatment of me revealed his character, not mine," Robert replied with the quiet wisdom that comes from years of moral consistency in difficult circumstances. "Revenge would have made me like him, David. Saving your life allowed me to remain who I've always chosen to be." The words carried the authority of someone who had tested his principles under extreme pressure and discovered that they remained intact. The dignity and compassion were not weakened by mistreatment, but strengthened by the choice to maintain them despite provocation. Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, ranging across questions of justice, family responsibility, and the kind of moral choices that define character more clearly than wealth or social position ever could. David spoke about his childhood in a family where money had gradually replaced love, where his father's increasing criminal success had been accompanied by the systematic erosion of basic human connection and ethical reasoning. Robert listened with the patient attention that had made him an exceptional concierge, offering insights that combined practical wisdom with genuine compassion for someone trying to build a moral life from the wreckage of criminal family legacy. The outcome of their conversation surprised both men, though perhaps it shouldn't have, given the moral logic that had brought them together. David announced his intention to use his inheritance, what remained after federal asset forfeiture and restitution to Cain's victims, to establish a foundation that would provide medical assistance to people whose families couldn't or wouldn't help them during health crises. More significantly, he asked Robert to serve as the foundation's executive director, recognizing that the same qualities that had made him an exceptional building concierge would translate into exceptional leadership of an organization dedicated to helping society's most vulnerable people. "Mr. Harris," David said as their meeting drew to a close, "you saved my life when my own father was prepared to let me die. That created a kind of moral debt that I can never really repay. but I can honor it by trying to help other people the way you helped me." He paused, gathering courage for a request that clearly meant more to him than mere professional employment. "I'd like you to consider becoming more than just the director of this foundation. I'd like you to become the father figure I never really had, the moral authority that can guide this work in ways that reflect the kind of character you've shown throughout this entire situation." Robert's acceptance of David's offer was delivered with the same quiet dignity that had sustained him throughout his ordeal with Cain, but it carried additional weight as he recognized that his years of invisible service had prepared him for a role where his moral authority would finally be visible and valued. "David," he said simply, "I'd be honored to help you build something good from the wreckage your father left behind. That's the kind of justice that matters most, not punishment, but transformation." The Harris Foundation for Medical Assistance was established 6 months later in offices located 2 blocks from the Millennium Tower, close enough that Robert could walk to work each morning past the building where he had spent 17 years learning the lessons that now qualified him to lead an organization dedicated to helping people who had been forgotten by families too selfish or corrupted to provide basic care during medical emergencies. The black cards that Cain had given him as symbols of wealth he would never possess had been framed and hung in Robert's office, not as trophies, but as reminders that dignity and moral authority possessed power that no amount of money could buy or corrupt. David's recovery continued steadily, but more importantly, his moral recovery from the toxic influence of his father's criminal worldview allowed him to develop into the kind of person who used inherited wealth as a tool for justice rather than instrument for personal aggrandizement. His relationship with Robert deepened into something that resembled the father-son bond that Cain's selfishness had prevented, built on mutual respect, shared commitment to helping others, and the recognition that true wealth consisted of character rather than currency. The foundation's work expanded rapidly as word spread through Chicago's medical community about an organization that didn't ask complicated questions about family finances or insurance coverage, but simply provided assistance to people who needed help and had nowhere else to turn. Robert's administrative skills, honed through decades of managing complex building operations with limited resources, proved perfectly suited to running a charitable organization that operated with the efficiency of a well-managed business, but the compassion of people who had learned through personal experience what it meant to be dismissed and undervalued by society's powerful institutions. On the first anniversary of Cain's arrest, Robert and David stood together in the foundation's offices, reviewing case files of people they had helped over the past year. Hundreds of families who had received medical assistance during crises, thousands of people who had been treated with dignity during their most vulnerable moments, an entire community of grateful individuals who now understood that genuine wealth consisted of people choosing to help each other without expectation of reward or recognition. The numbers were impressive, but more important was the transformation that both men had undergone during their journey from victim and perpetrator's son to moral partners in the work of justice and compassion. Cain remained in federal prison, serving the first years of a sentence that would likely extend for the remainder of his life, his cryptocurrency fortune seized and distributed to the victims of his crimes, his penthouse converted to affordable housing for Chicago families who had been displaced by gentrification and economic inequality. David received occasional letters from his father attempting to rebuild their relationship, but had chosen to focus his emotional energy on the surrogate father who had saved his life and the work that honored that salvation through service to others. As spring deepened into summer and Chicago bloomed with the promise of renewal and growth, Robert Harris continued his morning walks from Pilsen to the foundation offices, no longer invisible but still humble, no longer ignored but still focused on service rather than recognition. The city that had once seemed divided between those who mattered and those who didn't had revealed itself to be more complex, containing possibilities for justice and transformation, that became visible only to people willing to risk everything for principles that transcended personal safety and social position. The black cards remained framed on Robert's office wall, daily reminders that weapons intended for humiliation could become instruments of justice, that cruelty designed to maintain social hierarchy could inspire moral resistance that ultimately demonstrated the superiority of character over wealth, dignity over arrogance, and the quiet strength of ordinary people who refuse to remain silent when silence enables evil to flourish. Travis Kane had intended to teach Robert about the power of money and the permanence of social position. Instead, he had learned that true power belonged to those who used whatever authority they possessed, whether as building concierge or foundation director, in service of justice and compassion for people who needed help but had been forgotten by the systems designed to protect them. The story of Robert Harris and David Kane became something of a legend in Chicago's charitable community, told in social work schools and non-profit management courses as an example of how moral courage could transform tragedy into opportunity, how the right person in the right position could save lives and build institutions that outlasted the criminal empires that money alone could construct. But for Robert, the most meaningful aspect of his transformed life remained the simplest. Each morning when he walked to work, he knew that his labor served purposes that aligned with his deepest values, that his years of invisible service had prepared him for visible leadership, and that the dignity he had maintained through decades of dismissal and humiliation now provided the foundation for work that honored both his past suffering and his future contributions to a world that desperately needed people willing to choose compassion over comfort, justice over personal safety, and moral consistency over the temporary advantages that came from collaboration with wealth and power, regardless of their ethical foundation. Years passed in Chicago like pages turning in a slowly written book of redemption and justice, each season bringing new stories of lives changed through the work of the Harris Foundation for Medical Assistance, and with each passing month, the memory of Travis Kane's cruelty and criminal empire faded into the background of a city that had learned to honor the quiet heroes who emerged from its most humble neighborhoods to serve its most vulnerable residents. Robert Harris, now in his early 60s, had grown into his role as executive director, with the same steady competence that had once made him an exceptional concierge. But the work he did now carried the satisfaction of alignment between personal values and professional purpose that had been missing during his 17 years of invisible service in gleaming towers built on stolen wealth. The Foundation's offices had expanded to occupy an entire building in Chicago's Near West Side, a neighborhood that embodied the city's capacity for transformation and renewal. Where vacant lots had once marked the scars of urban decay, community gardens now flourished under the care of residents who had learned that collective action could accomplish what individual effort couldn't achieve. The Harris Foundation had become an anchor in this community renaissance, providing not just medical assistance, but employment opportunities, leadership development programs, and the kind of institutional stability that allowed working families to build lives of dignity and hope in neighborhoods that had been written off by conventional economic development strategies. Robert's daily routine began each morning with a walk through Pilsen that had become a form of moving meditation, a time to consider the day's challenges and opportunities while observing the gradual changes that marked a community's evolution from survival to prosperity. The corner bakery where he had bought fresh tortillas for solitary dinners during his concierge years now knew him as Mr. Harris from the Foundation, greeting him with the respect accorded to someone whose work had touched the lives of neighbors, relatives, and friends throughout the broader community. Children called out to him from school playgrounds, recognizing the man whose organization had helped their families during medical crises, and their parents waved from apartment windows with the gratitude of people who had experienced firsthand what genuine community support could accomplish. David Kane had become more than Robert's professional colleague. Their relationship had deepened into the kind of father-son bond that combined mutual respect with genuine affection and shared commitment to principles that transcended both their difficult histories. David's recovery from surgery had been complete, but more significantly, his recovery from the moral damage inflicted by growing up in a family where money had replaced love and criminal success had been valued more highly than basic human decency had transformed him into someone capable of using inherited privilege to serve rather than exploit the communities around him. The scope of their work together had expanded far beyond the medical assistance that had originally motivated the Foundation's creation. They had established scholarship programs for students whose academic potential was limited by family financial constraints, job training programs for adults whose employment opportunities had been restricted by criminal records or educational gaps, and community development initiatives that helped neighborhoods build the kind of institutional infrastructure that supported long-term prosperity rather than temporary charity. But throughout this expansion, they had maintained the personal approach that characterized Robert's leadership style. Every person served by the Foundation was treated as an individual with inherent dignity rather than a case number or statistical category. The work was demanding, but Robert found in it the satisfaction that had been missing during his years of maintaining buildings owned by people who valued property more than the human relationships that gave meaning to daily existence. Each day brought new challenges that required the same attention to detail, patience with difficult personalities, and ability to solve complex problems with limited resources that had made him an exceptional concierge. But now these skills were applied to helping people build better lives rather than maintaining the comfort of those who already possessed more wealth than they could meaningfully use. The most profound transformation in Robert's life, however, was not professional, but spiritual. The recognition that his years of apparent invisibility had actually been preparation for a kind of visibility that served purposes larger than personal advancement or social recognition. The humiliation he had endured from people like Travis Kane had taught him humility. The dismissal he had experienced from wealthy residents had taught him the value of treating every person with respect, and the careful observation required by his concierge duties had developed the kind of attention to human detail that made him exceptionally effective at understanding the needs of people who came to the Foundation during their most vulnerable moments. On a crisp October morning that reminded Robert of the day when he had first confronted Kane with evidence of his crimes, he received a phone call that brought his story full circle in ways that surprised him with their emotional complexity. The voice belonged to a federal corrections officer calling from the prison where Kane was serving his sentence, requesting Robert's permission for an inmate visit that Kane had apparently been requesting for months with increasing urgency. "Mr. Harris," the officer explained, "Travis Kane has been asking to meet with you for over a year now. He claims he has something important to discuss, something that might be relevant to your Foundation's work." The request stirred complicated emotions in Robert: anger at the man who had caused so much damage, curiosity about what Kane might have to say after years of imprisonment, and recognition that this meeting might provide closure to a chapter of his life that had never been properly concluded. The decision to visit Kane was made not from forgiveness. Robert had never been able to completely forgive the man who had been prepared to let his own son die rather than face consequences for criminal behavior, but from the same moral completeness that had motivated his intervention to save David's life. If Kane had information that could help the Foundation serve more people, then Robert's personal feelings about their past relationship became secondary to his professional obligation to explore every opportunity to expand the organization's impact. The federal correctional facility where Kane was housed stood like a monument to the consequences of choices made without regard for moral or legal constraints. Its concrete walls and razor wire serving as permanent reminders that wealth and sophistication provided no protection against the fundamental requirements of justice. Robert approached the visiting room with the same careful preparation he had once applied to maintaining building security systems, uncertain about what he would find, but committed to conducting himself with the dignity that had sustained him through their previous encounters. Cain had aged badly during his years in prison, his formerly expensive appearance replaced by the standardized clothing and institutional haircut that marked him as indistinguishable from hundreds of other inmates who had discovered too late that criminal success was temporary, but its consequences were permanent. His eyes, once sharp with predatory confidence, now held the hollow quality of someone who had spent years contemplating the wreckage of choices that could never be undone or adequately justified. "Robert," Cain said as they sat across from each other at a metal table designed more for security than comfort, his voice carrying none of the arrogant authority that had once made their interactions so difficult to endure. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would agree to see me." The words carried the careful tone of someone who had learned through hard experience that he was no longer in a position to make demands or assumptions about other people's willingness to interact with him. "I came because they said you might have information that could help my foundation," Robert replied, maintaining the professional distance that had served him well during their business relationship, while acknowledging the fundamental change in their relative positions that prison walls and moral choices had created. "If you have something useful to contribute, I'm willing to listen." Cain's response revealed the complex mixture of genuine remorse and residual selfishness that marked his character even after years of imprisonment and reflection. "I do have information that could help your foundation," he said carefully, "but I also wanted to apologize for the way I treated you during all those years when you worked in my building. I was cruel, dismissive, and completely wrong about your character and capabilities." The apology carried the weight of someone who had finally understood what his arrogance had cost not just his victims, but himself, though Robert suspected that Cain's regret was motivated as much by his current circumstances as by genuine moral transformation. "Your apology is noted," Robert said with the careful neutrality that had characterized his responses to Cain's previous attempts at conversation. "But I'm more interested in the information you mentioned. What do you know that might help people who are facing medical crises without family support?" The question redirected their conversation away from personal relationships toward the practical purposes that had motivated Robert to risk a visit to someone whose influence on his life had been so consistently negative. Cain reached into his prison uniform pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper covered with the kind of detailed notes that suggested months of careful preparation. "Robert, during my years in the cryptocurrency business, I worked with dozens of other criminals who were running similar fraud operations. Most of them have been arrested by now, but their victims, thousands of people who lost life savings to investment scams, never received adequate restitution because the stolen money was hidden in offshore accounts and digital wallets that prosecutors couldn't locate." He unfolded the paper and spread it on the table between them, revealing a hand-drawn map of cryptocurrency transactions, hidden accounts, and digital asset storage systems that represented millions of dollars in stolen funds that could potentially be recovered and returned to victims or used for charitable purposes. This information could help law enforcement agencies recover assets that would otherwise remain hidden forever. If those funds could be redirected to your foundation, you could help thousands of additional people who are currently beyond your reach. Robert studied the document with the same careful attention he had once applied to building maintenance schedules and security protocols, recognizing immediately that Cain's information represented the kind of intelligence breakthrough that could transform the foundation's financial capacity and expand its ability to serve some of Chicago's most vulnerable residents. But he also understood that accepting Cain's assistance would create an ethical complexity that required careful consideration of the relationship between justice and redemption, between punishment and the possibility of criminals contributing something positive to the communities they had damaged. "Why are you giving me this information?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the suspicion of someone who had learned through difficult experience that Cain's apparent generosity often concealed self-serving motivations. What do you expect to gain from helping the foundation recover assets from your criminal associates? The question addressed the fundamental trust issue that had always complicated their interactions. Kane's demonstrated willingness to prioritize personal benefit over basic human decency made any apparently altruistic gesture suspect until proven otherwise. Kane's response revealed the complex emotional journey he had undergone during years of imprisonment and reflection on the choices that had destroyed his family relationships and criminal career. "I don't expect to gain anything, Robert. I'm going to die in this prison, and I'll never have a relationship with my son because of what I chose to prioritize when he needed me most." His voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had finally understood the true cost of his criminal success. But if this information can help you save other people's children, then maybe some small part of the damage I caused can be transformed into something useful. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Kane providing detailed explanations of cryptocurrency fraud techniques, money laundering strategies, and asset hiding methods that represented a graduate-level education in financial crimes and their investigation. Robert asked questions with the same systematic thoroughness that had made him an exceptional concierge, testing Kane's knowledge and motivations while evaluating the practical utility of information that could potentially help the foundation expand its mission in ways that aligned with its core values. As their visit concluded, and Kane was escorted back to his cell by corrections officers, Robert remained in the visiting room considering the moral implications of accepting assistance from someone whose criminal behavior had caused so much damage to innocent people. The information Kane had provided was undoubtedly valuable, potentially worth millions of dollars in recovered assets that could fund medical assistance for thousands of people who desperately needed help. But utilizing that information would also mean acknowledging Kane as a contributor to the foundation's work, creating a complicated legacy that mixed genuine service with the fruits of criminal collaboration. The decision Robert ultimately made reflected the same moral reasoning that had guided his intervention to save David's life: focus on helping innocent people rather than maintaining ideological purity about the sources of assistance. Working with federal prosecutors and financial crimes investigators, Robert helped facilitate the recovery of nearly $40 million in stolen cryptocurrency and fraudulent investment assets, funds that were redirected to victim restitution and charitable purposes through a legal process that recognized Kane's cooperation while ensuring that he received no personal benefit from his assistance. The expanded resources allowed the Harris Foundation to extend its medical assistance programs throughout the Midwest, helping families in rural communities and small cities that lacked the institutional infrastructure available in Chicago. But more importantly, the experience taught Robert that redemption was possible even for people like Kane, though it required acknowledgement of damage caused, acceptance of appropriate consequences, and commitment to using whatever knowledge or resources remained available to serve the people and communities that had been harmed by criminal behavior. David's response to his father's cooperation with the foundation was measured but positive, recognizing that Kane's assistance represented genuine moral progress without excusing the years of selfish choices that had nearly cost David his life and had destroyed their family relationships beyond repair. "He's finally contributing something positive to the world," David told Robert during one of their regular strategy meetings, "though it doesn't change what he did or restore what was lost. But if his information helps other families avoid what we went through, then I suppose even criminals can serve justice in the end." As Chicago's autumn deepened toward winter and the city prepared once again for the harsh weather that tested its residents' resilience and mutual dependence, Robert Harris continued his daily work with the satisfaction of someone whose life had achieved the kind of alignment between personal values and professional purpose that most people never experience. The years of invisible service as a building concierge had prepared him for visible leadership of an organization that served invisible people, those forgotten by families, dismissed by institutions, and overlooked by communities, too focused on wealth and status, to recognize the dignity inherent in every human life. The black cards that Cain had once given him as symbols of exclusion and humiliation remained framed in his office, daily reminders that instruments intended for cruelty could become tools for justice, that apparent endings could become meaningful beginnings, and that the true measure of character was revealed not during moments of comfort and security, but during times when moral choices demanded personal sacrifice and courage. Robert had learned that dignity was not diminished by service, but enhanced by it, that invisible work could have profound visible consequences, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into reluctant allies in the struggle between justice and the indifference that allowed suffering to continue unopposed. The story that had begun with casual cruelty in a marble lobby had evolved into something larger and more hopeful, a demonstration that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to exercise it in service of principles that transcended personal safety and comfort. Robert Harris had spent 17 years as a concierge, learning to see what others missed, to remember what others forgot, and to serve what others ignored. Those skills had prepared him for leadership that transformed lives, built institutions, and created communities where dignity and mutual support replaced the casual cruelty that wealth and power too often justified as natural and inevitable. And you? Have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Walking through hallways where your footsteps echo unheard, fixing problems while others take credit, carrying responsibilities that would crumble without your steady care? Tell me your story in the comments below, because every person who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated as if they don't matter needs to know that their quiet dignity carries more power than all the black cards and corner offices in the world. Your work matters, your observations count, and your character commands respect that no amount of wealth can buy or destroy. If this story touched something in your chest, that tight place where years of being undervalued have left their mark, then leave a like and subscribe so it reaches someone else who needs to know that invisible doesn't mean powerless, that service doesn't mean servitude, and that sometimes the people who seem to matter least are the ones who matter most. For more stories that honor the dignity of honest work and quiet courage, click the podcast link on the left and let these narratives remind you that every concierge, every janitor, every security guard, and every person who keeps the world running while others take the credit possesses the kind of moral authority that can move mountains when they finally decide to stop accepting what should never have been acceptable in the first place. Thank you for walking this path with us, for seeing yourself in Robert's dignity and David's gratitude, and for remembering that the greatest transformations often begin with the quiet decision to refuse invisibility when justice demands to be seen. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary heroes continue to prove that character matters more than cash, and that sometimes the most powerful words are spoken by those who have been silent so long that people forgot they were listening, watching, and remembering everything.